Welcome to video 2.4, What If? Using parameters and slicers to filter and explore. In the previous video, we took a look at two heat map custom visuals. In this video, we'll use a parameter and slicers to explore a what if scenario. Slicers are Power BI visuals that act as interactive filters. Parameters are virtual data series that, when attached to visuals and slicers, let you explore what if scenarios. You might be used to such a workflow from Excel. We'll start by opening up the report from last video. You could also open the prepared report from code files, drug data video 2.3.pbix. Let's start by adding a simple checkbox slicer to the time series page. First, create some room by shrinking a couple of the visuals. Then, click in the blank area to ensure no visual is selected, and find Slicer in the Visualizations palette. From Drug Company, drag company name to the field of the slicer. This lets us choose one company at a time and filters all the visuals accordingly. We can also make it multi-select by going to the Format pane and under Selection Controls, turning Single Select off. Now we can stack up a few companies for comparison. Click the tiny eraser icon to clear the filter. Next, let's add a timeline-specific filter. We'll use the Timeline Slicer custom visual. Go from the ellipsis in the palette, choose Import from Marketplace, and under Categories, use Time. Find Timeline Slicer, and click Add. Once it is imported, click OK. Click again in the canvas to ensure no visual is selected, and then click the new Timeline icon in the palette. Bind Invoice Date to Time. By default, it shows all the data. Let's look at 2017. Click Year in the Granularity selector at the top left. Click 2017 in the timeline. Now, one of the KPIs fails at this point. It's the one using sales year to date, which requires a date hierarchy. When we're explicitly driving the dates from a slicer, year to date doesn't make sense. So, let's switch to sales, like all the others are using. That's better. Now we can play with the slicer. Let's try showing the most recent fiscal year. Our fiscal year starts at the beginning of quarter 2. Choose the quarter granularity. To choose Q3 2017 through Q2 2018, first click Q3 2017, and then you can either drag out the end of the range slider or just hold Shift and click Q2 2018. Looking up, to get back to all the data, click between the axis labels. Let's try something similar, yet a little more sophisticated, for our heat maps. Pop over to the heat maps page and shorten both visuals to make some room for our slicer. Once again, we're going to import from Marketplace, but this time when it opens up, under Categories, we're going to go to Filters. And we'll scroll down to Time Brush Slicer and click Add. We'll hit OK when it's imported. Click in the canvas to ensure we haven't selected a visual, and then click Time Brush and drag it to fit our available space. Date receives our usual invoice date with values sales, segmented by company name. Now we have a dense stacked bar chart with a date axis. This provides both an overview of total sales over time, as well as an interface to select in time. You can drag in the chart to set a time range that will filter the rest of the visuals. You can adjust the window by dragging the grippers at the ends of it, and then you can move a window as a whole. In this case, we've created a literal 1-year sliding window. Now we're going to create a tax scenario to answer the question, what if a new sales tax comes into effect? First, let's create a new page for our scenario. Right-click on the Baseline tab and choose Duplicate Page. Drag the new tab next to Baseline since it's a derivative of it. Right-click on it, click Rename Page, and we'll call it Tax Scenario. Next, we'll create a parameter to set the tax value. In the Modeling tab in the ribbon, use New Parameter, and from the What If Parameter dialog box, call it Tax. Make it a decimal number because we'll be multiplying it by currencies, and let's set the maximum to 40, which will interpret as a whopping 40% tax. Set the default to 0 to match our baseline, and uncheck Add Slicer to this page, as We're not ready for the slicer, and it would add a checkbox list anyway, which isn't what we want. Click OK. Next, we need our metric to respond to the tax parameter. We do this over in the data pane. Discounting the total sales by the tax percent converted to a ratio. So let's create a new measure on drug sales. Now, since this is a measure rather than a column, we'll want the totals, specifically of the sales values, so we use sum on our drug sales column, and then here we're calculating the tax as a percent. That should do the trick. Back to the report. We've created a metric corresponding to our sales calculated column, but with the tax parameter applied. Now we need to use that as the measure for all our visuals. So, for the KPI, drag taxable sales to indicator. For the waterfall chart, drag taxable sales to y-axis. It goes to values in our area chart and to value in the ribbon chart. Now we should expose the tax value. Let's replace the count KPI, since it's the least interesting one. Select it, hit the delete key to remove it, click in the blank space just in case, and then click Slicer in the Visualizations palette. Drag it out for some room, and now under Tax, drag the tax parameter to the field of the slicer. You should now see a slider bar and an input box, and when you drag the slider, the visuals all update to reflect the increased tax. You can see how slicers and parameters quickly add a lot of analytical depth to a dashboard. Be sure to save your work. In the next video, we'll learn how to export data from visuals.